When you stop and think about dangers in motorsport, what comes to your mind immediately? A lot of things, right? Like races at Nürburgring or the prestigious 24 Hours of Le Mans, maybe the insane Isle of Man. But what if I told you that these are nothing compared to an illegal race that existed in the US? What would you expect from a place where Hollywood's elite lives, like Leo DiCaprio, Johnny Depp, Cameron Diaz? You'd expect safety and tranquility, expensive mansions, glamour, and status. But that same neighborhood in the past and at night was one of the most dangerous places in the world. It was wild over there. What the world's biggest artists expected from the place was this. But when the lights went out, they were faced with this. While some dreamed of racing in Formula 1, some crazy people participated in the most insane illegal race of all, risking their lives for a thrill. An unknown story until now, but one that inspired games and movies that were part of your childhood, like the nostalgic Need for Speed. This is a place where the obsession to become the top dog would go above any obstacle, and when the lights went down, the fight to become the king of the mountain. How it all began. It all begins with a guy named William Mulholland, a guy you might know as the father of Los Angeles. This strong recognition comes from the fact that when William was just 14 years old, he ran away from home in Ireland and ended up in a small town called Los Angeles, which had about 50,000 residents. None of them knew it, but that teenager, almost a refugee, would be the main person responsible for the expansion of what is now California's largest city. When the Irishman arrived there, the city was extremely quiet. He got a job digging ditches, and his work ensured that water reached its destination, the homes and businesses of the city. It seemed like something simple, but the water issue was a significant reason why Los Angeles was stagnant in terms of its population. Mulholland was doing his job perfectly, and little by little he was climbing the ranks, until in 1890 he reached the position of superintendent of the Los Angeles Water Department, where he stayed for 10 years, and during that time the population doubled. But there came a time when managing all that was becoming more difficult. The more people there were to manage, the more laborious it became. So to improve the management and support the new residents, William and the mayor at the time, Meredith, implemented plans that were quite controversial to ensure water rates for the new residents of LA. Mulholland built an aqueduct more than 233 miles long, using only gravity to pull water from the lake to the city, which ended up depriving water from farmers and agricultural workers, causing a widespread rebellion and the destruction of part of the Irishman's project. Despite all this turmoil, he was proud of his architecture and made it clear that he wanted to transform Los Angeles into the largest city in the country at any. Despite being controversial, his contribution to the city led to schools, dams, and highways being named in his honor. And so we come to today's protagonist, the famous road created by Chief Engineer DeWitt Rayburn. The American, who was also behind the creation of the aqueduct with the Irishman, created the road not only to be the most scenic in the United States, but also to make it the most enjoyable to drive. The road was open to the public in 1924, and soon people started bringing their cars to test the track, obviously in a civilized way, and they ended up discovering that it really was a beautiful road, but also extremely dangerous. But that wasn't really a problem for some. In fact, it made it even more attractive to enthusiasts. The first reports of illegal races wouldn't take long to arrive, and they came from people very well known to Americans. Gary Cooper, a renowned actor, would finish his work in Hollywood and take his Dosenberg to race on Mulholland Drive. A few years later, the mountain had its first king, and it was Dick Gouldstrand, better known as Mr. Corvette. The California native abandoned a promising career to dedicate his life to his passion for speed, making history with the Corvette in the late 1960s. Dick grew up in Southern California, where he developed a passion for speed. At 16, he was already racing a modified Model T on the dry lakes of El Mirage and Muroc. His love for cars and racing led him to set a speed record in a Model A at 17. For his parents, who encouraged him to study law, it was an inexplicable pain to see him running from the law on Mulholland. But the cops never caught the crafty one, and that was a great test for learning to race under pressure. Even when he was already experienced and known in the racing world with the 24 hours of Le Mans and Daytona under his belt, the race up the hill was his favorite. And he was never alone. Many people would bring their race cars to compete on the forbidden night of Mulholland Drive without anyone knowing. With the growing reputation, more drivers, lunatics, and enthusiasts showed up, and among them all, one guy stood out. A quiet, unknown guy who ended up becoming the center of attention. Chris Banning. The Kings emerge. Chris grew up right there, at the foot of the mountain, watching the enthusiasts pass by with engines roaring near his house. That caught his attention, and soon, at 12 years old, with his mom's 1966 Ford Mustang V8, the American experienced the road for the first time. He kept at it, learning, until he saved up some money and bought a Fiat 850 Spider. And to improve the garage's arsenal, his mom would buy a Porsche 911T, considered impossible not to test the car. Of course, he also went straight to test it on Mulholland Drive, and then he would have the perfect combination in his home garage. He was constantly seeking adrenaline, and he was always seen driving various cars on the road that he now knew better than himself, just like his friend John Hall, who, with his Volkswagen, beat challengers who came from all over the country. He had a little Volks, but I've seen him whoop a lot of Corvettes. Chris. The enthusiasts were always looking for new competitors, and some would hand out business cards around the city to attract new drivers to the illegal racetrack. While some were there for the passion of speed, others even use it as a financial stepping stone, like a guy named Bart, who charged $40 to tow wrecked cars from inexperienced drivers. Chris was getting better every day and was always looking to upgrade the machines he drove, and his next car would be a Porsche 911S Turbo. With the 911, he became relentless, and the American felt unbeatable, but he wasn't. But one day, while enjoying the peace of a quiet night on the mountain with no races, he saw a 1950 GMC pickup truck fly by, with all its lights off. That was the well-known Crazy Charlie, almost like a ghost. You'll hardly find any record of this guy, but Charles Francis was an otherwise ordinary man. He loved his pet reptiles and couldn't stop talking about art, gold paintings, and nature. He was a true hippie of the time. But when the lights went out, he transformed into Crazy Charlie, the craziest guy Mulholland Drive had ever seen. He had the most aggressive, even suicidal driving style among them all, and his many scars from accidents spoke for themselves. People close to him said he wasn't just very good on the tracks, but he also had talent in many other areas. That he was the king of the hill, no one doubted. He was Chris Banning's official executioner, and he raced against him while sipping his cold beer, and when he passed him, he tossed the can out the window just to show off. The once unbeatable Chris would push hard trying to catch up with the GMC pickup, but he always got a whooping from Charles, and they said the more he drank, the faster he was. I was shocked that someone would actually race to the death like that. Chris Banning. The American who raced the 911S once nearly lost control of the Porsche, almost plummeting into the valley, all while trying to keep up with the pickup, and his co-pilot never raced with him again out of fear. He never got in the car with me again after that night. To this day, he won't get in a car I'm driving. Chris. But once, with a lot of persistence, Banning managed to beat the Crazy Charlie pickup and regain a piece of his pride. But the pickup that Chris lost to many times had half the horsepower of his Porsche, and so a battle began. Charlie, the madman, decided to level the playing field, and things got even crazier. And before what was an otherwise friendly rivalry turned into the War of the Mountain. Crazy Charlie's life wasn't just about drinking and racing. He also worked at a Hollywood garage, working on vehicles for the stars of the time, like Steve McQueen and the famous stuntman Bud Ekins. There he made good contacts and got help from Mr. Corvette to build the car of his dreams. With a simple and stripped-down interior, fender flares to accommodate large racing tires, his Corvette 427 was duly assembled. But as mentioned before, the level of the races would increase, making the seriousness of these guys in this illegal race even more evident. Chris knew he couldn't get comfortable. He was aware that if he didn't improve his car, he'd get beaten by Charlie again. So the American also started a new project, again using the 911, but this time the 1974 model. He built the car with a single purpose, to race, win, and dominate Mulholland Drive. Chris disassembled the chassis and dipped it in an acid bath with the goal of shaving at least 3 pounds off the car. The roof was also cut, and the front windshield was tilted back, sacrificing some space in favor of making the 911 more aerodynamic. All this modding was reinforced with an aluminum roll cage. To match the Corvette, Chris also put on wider tires and fender flares equivalent to those on a turbo car. The engine was a 170 cubic inch from an RSR, a model from which the Porsche also inherited a new suspension. And to really go all out, the American also learned German. The reason? To travel to Germany to learn and communicate with Porsche specialists. When he got to Stuttgart, Chris met Johanna Baer, who showed him several factory projects and the most incredible cars that had been made. But he only wanted to know one thing. The American took the opportunity to tell Johanna about Mulholland and said he needed to find the ideal setup to be able to go full throttle in the tight corners and handle the road's roughness better. Johanna met Chris's demand and showed him a giant vault at the factory with the same level of protection as the richest banks in the world. But in there, they had something money couldn't buy: decades and decades of Porsche research. In the vault were books the American didn't even know existed, from the most basic model manuals to technical documents for setting up the cars however he wanted and according to almost any situation that could exist. There, his big advantage was established, so Banning took what he needed and returned to Los Angeles. After all the adjustments were properly made, the car was supposedly more dominant than ever and was about to come to fruition, and indeed it turned into glory. It was almost a divine connection between the car and Mulholland Drive, and the story of the built car began to descend from the hill and catch the attention of the media enthusiasts and the authorities. With the rumors spreading in the city, it didn't take long for the police to show up in force on the hill, trying to end the illegal events, arresting first the curious and spectators who didn't have the same wits as the competitors, and the rebels like Chris and Charlie, well, they knew the territory better than anyone, and they always escaped with the headlights off with prepared and lightweight cars, while the cops used the complete opposite in the chases. They didn't stand a chance. Chris's car didn't even have plates, which made it easier to flee, but since the police LTDs couldn't keep up, they started resorting to faster cars and even helicopters sometimes. Once, the Americans' luck almost ran out when the cops recognized the Americans' Porsche parked. As soon as they saw the silver car without plates, the spotlight turned on, and Chris had to floor it to get away. Aside from the cops on his tail, everything was going well. His performance with the Porsche left no chance for anyone, but something was still missing. He hadn't managed to face Crazy Charlie, so Chris still didn't consider himself the king of the hill, and unfortunately, the showdown didn't seem like it was going to happen again. The attention had already gone beyond what Chris Banning wanted, and to give you an idea, in 1981, the story of the illegal race became a movie. In the film called King of the Mountain, Harry Hamlin played a guy named Steve, a character very similar to Chris, except he drove a 356 Speedster. Dennis Hopper played the role of the rival named Cal, who was exactly like Charles. He was the former King of the Mountain, a crazy drunk who put all the other drivers in his pocket while driving his pickup when he wasn't grabbing a Corvette to fight Steve. Now, spoiler alert, in the movie, Steve decides he doesn't want to risk his life against the crazy Cal and lets him take the King of the Mountain crown. Cal, winning in his Corvette, falls victim to the road moments later. The movie wasn't exactly a box office hit. The critics said you could barely see the racing scenes in the film, and they looked more like lanterns in the dark than cars. Even so, the project inspired more artists and producers to make racing movies, and of course the movie drew even more eyes to Mulholland Drive, which officially became a stage for the most varied enthusiasts. But the Hill Road didn't forgive amateurs. From 1980 to 1982, more than 140 people were injured, and 4 lost their lives. During that time, Chris stayed away from the road, still scared after his last escape and afraid of losing his fully modified 911. But his thirst for adrenaline spoke louder, and so the American had an idea. He got a fully modified Camaro, painted it red, and went to race, but he felt something was wrong. It was a feeling of being far from home. For some reason, I felt insecure. But the luck that Chris had had all those years ran out. At that time, there was a guy named Darl, also causing trouble in Mulholland, driving a Camaro. When the cops saw a red Camaro, they thought it was Darl and called for reinforcements to arrest the guy. Everyone was looking at me, gesturing and saying, "Get out of here." I just thought, what's wrong with everyone? Then, when Chris looked back and saw the siren in the rearview mirror, he knew he was in trouble. But once again, he managed to escape, but he saw that the red Camaro was also doomed, so he sold it shortly after. And soon, one thing became clear: the veterans were doomed to jail, so they barely went out to race. The rookies, drivers from other regions, and overly confident enthusiasts would go there and constantly get involved in serious accidents. The situation was getting too delicate for Mulholland Drive, until one of the most brutal accidents in that area happened when a 12-year-old boy was hit by a driver who was trying to escape from the authorities. With the tragedy, the city adopted an emergency order and completely shut down the Mulholland area. The accident happened just 2 days after Chris's Camaro escape. Crazy Charlie, Banning's biggest racing rival, died around the same time in an accident on Vasquez Canyon Road. The accidents and the attention from the authorities on the illegal events didn't drive everyone away. Some continued to race, like Chuck Turner, who had already had his car impounded thousands of times. He would pay the fine and go back to racing the same night he got caught. That was the level of addiction these guys had to the winding road. But with all the obstacles, Chuck eventually quit racing and moved to Hawaii, where he worked as a photographer for the famous Hustler magazine. Chris also decided to step away from it, and later built a shed to store his 911 Porsche. And curiously, sometime later, in 1994, Los Angeles was hit by a major earthquake with a magnitude of 6.7, which destroyed the King of the Hills house, but the shed where the car was stored remained intact. He kept the car hidden for a long time and went on to pursue other projects, including a vast car collection. Everything seemed to be over, and apparently Mulholland Drive was quiet once and for all, until years later, in 2007, a thread was created on the Pelican Parts forum with the following question: what happened to the king of the Mulholland Hill? The answers came in surprisingly, showing that the love for the winding streets of Los Angeles was still alive in memory, even after 80 years of its existence. Former residents and racers, still enthusiasts, filled the forum with photos, videos, and stories about their experiences in that place. Today the thread has almost 380 pages of information about Chris, his cars, and the races, and it has more than 1,500,000 views. In fact, many of the photos you saw today were taken from this incredible source. All the buzz inspired Chris to restore the Porsche and bring it back to the streets, but its scratches and race marks were kept. The car was also put on display at the Peterson Automotive Museum. Mulholland Drive was the reason for many things you know today: movies, video games, books, and even a special edition of Porsche's 911 car. The area still attracts the craziest enthusiasts to race there, though less frequently than in the 90s, but just as deadly as before. Chris Banning also wrote a book about it, called The Mulholland Experience, and the American is already planning a new, more complete version of his stories on the hill. Unfortunately, we never had another encounter between Chris and Charles, who were now fully equipped, but the rivalry that remained marked several generations who grew up in the Los Angeles area. In fact, that so-called City of Angels is the stage for another insane race called the Cannonball Run, a race against time to see who gets to New York in the shortest time, against the cops, against everything and everyone. A race as old as the one we told you about. But enough spoilers, get comfy on the couch because the video has already started on your screen. See you soon.